Hello, this is Michael Tracy, and this video is about George Mallory's plan for the 1924 climb, how it was eventually canceled by Norton, and how Mallory revived it while Norton was on his own summit attempt. This video will start to present a view of Mallory that he is not a naive schoolteacher going for a hike up the mountain. Instead, he is intelligent, driven, and willing to do whatever it takes to make it to the summit. And in the watch video, we will see exactly how far he is willing to go. As a refresher on what happened on the 1924 climb, the June 8th climb, in which Mallory and Irvine perished, was never supposed to happen. What was supposed to be Mallory's final climb started on June 1st, when he and Geoffrey Bruce left North Col in an attempt without oxygen. Because of logistical problems, it had been agreed that no attempts with oxygen would be made, and that there would be 2 non-oxygen attempts, with Mallory given his choice of climbers for the first attempt and Norton selecting Somerville for the second attempt. Curiously, Mallory chooses Geoffrey Bruce, an inexperienced climber who was only on the expeditions because he was a relative of Charles Bruce, the expedition leader for both 1922 and 1924. In 1924, Charles Bruce went tiger hunting shortly before the expedition, and although he killed the tiger, he contracted malaria. Shortly into the expedition, he had to be evacuated, and Edward Norton took over as expedition leader, but Geoffrey Bruce remained as a climber. While Mallory never explains why, given the pick of all the climbers, he chose Geoffrey Bruce, subscribers will likely be able to figure out what is going on. Mallory and Bruce do not make it far and abort their climb on June 2nd, having just established Camp 5. They provide a number of reasons for turning around: high winds, exhausted Sherpas, and Bruce's heart having problems. After Mallory and Bruce turn around, they are met by Norton and Somerville, who are starting their own climb from North Col to Camp 5. At this point, Norton and Somerville's attempt, which would be made on June 4th, was the last planned summit attempt, the idea of using oxygen having been abandoned, at least in theory. That is, when Norton and Somerville headed up, they believed their attempt was the final attempt, and the success or failure depended entirely on them. However, unbeknownst to Norton, Mallory was working behind his back and implementing one half of a plan that was devised over a month ago, but thought to have been abandoned. Without Norton knowing, Mallory somehow managed to get a large cache of oxygen up to the North Col, and also enough fit Sherpas to carry it to Camp 6. This dramatic change in events is only told to Norton 2 days later, when he is lying in his tent snowblind and unable to make it back to Advanced Base Camp unassisted. As all the oxygen supplies had just been moved up to North Col, Norton had little choice but to allow the climb, noting with astonishment how all the supplies magically came up to North Col so quickly. While I will not get into the details of the June 8th climb until the watch video, the idea that Mallory and Irvine headed up the mountain in some quixotic attempt at the summit is contradicted by the numerous documents outlining a detailed plan and massive Sherpa support that was utilized in bringing the equipment and provisions to Camp 6 at 26,700 feet, all the while leaving Mallory and Irvine relatively well rested as they were carrying light loads and using oxygen. On their final climb, Mallory and Irvine arrived at camps that were already established and stocked by others, and they had nothing more to do than melt snow and rest. And while the climbing above Camp 6 was done by Mallory and Irvine alone, Camp 6 itself and the massive number of oxygen bottles brought there were all put in place by others. Back in 1922, Mallory realized oxygen was essential to making the summit because of how well Finch and Bruce climbed. Some of the support personnel had bet on who would get higher in 1922, Mallory or Finch, and it was hard enough being beaten by Finch, but that Geoffrey Bruce, a climber who had never climbed on ice prior to Everest, was able to climb higher than Mallory, likely convinced Mallory of the benefits of oxygen. However, the problem with oxygen is that someone has to carry it, and that problem would not be worked out until April of 1924. Early in the 1924 expedition, Mallory had what he called a brainwave, and on April 17, 1924, he writes a fairly detailed plan to his wife Ruth in a letter home. On April 19th, he fills in more details of the plan in a letter to Longstaff, and I will use that letter for this analysis as it has additional information about the movement of the porters. Longstaff was a climber on the 1922 expedition, but was not present in 1924. The letter from Mallory is preserved by the Alpine Club, and it is worth pausing the video here to read what a massive undertaking Mallory was envisioning. The basics are for 2 parties to reach the summit at the same time, one using oxygen and one without. The gasless party will use a total of 7 camps, 4 on the upper mountain, with Camp 7 being where the 1933 Camp 6 was eventually placed. The oxygen party will spend the night lower at Camp 6. Mallory writes, The two parties start an hour or more before daylight in full moonlight and windless air, we hope, and meet on the summit. We're going to sail to the top this time, God with us, or stamp to the top with the wind in our teeth. While a romantic sentiment, it hardly captures what the plan outlines. Most of the plan is detailing the massive number of porters that will be needed to move all the oxygen into place, how much they will need to carry, and when they need to carry it. In all, the plan requires 26 high-altitude porters, 16 of whom will carry loads and 10 who will climb into support to set up the tents and perform other support functions. Although not explicitly stated in the plan, it appears that the non-carrying Sherpas were supposed to accompany them on the summit bid at least part of the way, presumably carrying the extra oxygen. For the oxygen party, he has the Sherpas using the oxygen at the camps, likely because of the limited number of apparatuses. That is, they would take turns using the oxygen while resting, the same way the Chinese did in 1975. And while he does not explicitly state the Sherpas will carry oxygen for the summit bid, there are an unusually high number of Sherpa left in the oxygen party's high camp, and it is reasonable to assume that he planned on using them to carry some of the oxygen higher. This notion is supported by a passage written by Norton where he addresses some unnamed people who advocated, quote, adding a good Sherpa porter to a party of 2 climbers for the last lap on Mount Everest. Norton indicates that he himself once advocated this, but no longer did, and this corresponds to him initially approving the plan and then later changing his mind. And although the other people who advocated for this are unnamed, Mallory's plan clearly lines up with using Sherpas for the last lap up the mountain, and you need only watch Rashomon to see why he might leave this detail out in letters to his wife and a climbing colleague. Given that the bulk of the work would be done by the Sherpas, Mallory is very confident in the plan. He later writes to Ruth, "It is almost unthinkable with this plan that I shan't get to the top. I can't see myself coming down defeated, and I have very good hopes that the gasless party will get up. I want all 4 of us to get there, and I believe it can be done. We shall be starting at moonlight if the morning is calm and should have the mountain climbed if we're lucky before the wind is dangerous." For this plan, we can see Mallory has not only fixated on getting to the summit, but he had a workable plan to do so. Noticeably missing from this detailed plan was any mention of climbing the second step, and with 2 parties climbing simultaneously, any such obstacle would clearly be discussed, as the lead party would do all the work and then fix the rope for the rest. Looking at the details of this plan, we can see the final climb of June 8th starting to come into place. First, Mallory intended to start well before sunrise, and this matches up with his final letter to John Knoll, instructing him to look for him starting at 8 a.m. This would require a start time of 3 a.m. or 4 a.m. to be in Knoll's view at 8 a.m. to 9 a.m. As a note, Mallory has the incorrect altitude for Camp 6 in his plan, and he lists 26,500 rather than 26,700 where the platform is. However, for this analysis, I will use the 26,500 because it indicates what Mallory thought about the climb. That is, Mallory thought an oxygen party would make the 2,500 vertical feet from his hypothetical Camp 6 at about the same time as the oxygenless party would make the 1,700 vertical feet from his hypothetical Camp 7. Some basic math says that for a 10-hour climb, the oxygenless party would be making 250 vertical feet per hour, and the non-oxygen party would be making 170 vertical feet per hour. This is an extremely realistic climb rate for both parties, and it indicates that Mallory was expecting a moderate increase in climb rates from oxygen, but nothing superhuman. For comparison, Conrad Anker and Dave Hahn did 165 vertical feet per hour in 1999, with a good portion done without oxygen. And in 2007, Tim Medvets was able to do 230 vertical feet per hour with oxygen, but a broken hand. He is the biker dude from Everest Beyond the Limit. These climb times are detailed in the Mallory versus Modern video, and Mallory had very realistic estimates for climb times. Norton and Mallory go on to work on this plan, and a detailed schedule is typed up that has the 2 parties meeting on the summit on May 17th. However, as things develop, it is impossible to put that many fit climbers on the mountain, and the plan is eventually abandoned. However, after the brainwave for the logistics on May 17th, Mallory turns to choosing a route. On April 21st, Mallory and Irvine both look at Everest together. Irvine's diary notes, "As the transport were starting off, Mallory and I climbed a small hill behind the camp to get a view of Everest. We examined the north and east side of the final pyramid very carefully with glasses." Later that evening, the composition of the parties is announced, and Irvine writes, "After dinner, we were allotted to our climbing parties. Odell and Jeff to pilot Camp 5, Norton Somerville first non-oxygen climb, Mallory and Self first oxygen climb, Odell, Joff, Hazard, and Beatum reserve. I'm awfully glad that I'm with Mallory in the first lot, but I wish ever so much that it was a non-oxygen attempt. The all caps was done by Irvine himself, however perhaps there is a little Rashomon in it. A couple days later, Mallory and Irvine would take another look at Everest from Pangloss, and this photo was taken by Noel Odell, capturing the moment. Irvine wrote in his diary, "From the top of the pass, we had a perfectly wonderful view of Everest and the rest of the Himalaya. We spent a long time with the glasses and telescope trying to pick out campsites. It looked as if there were no place between 25,000 and 28,000. So it appears that on April 21, Mallory identified his two choices of route, and by April 28, he was more concerned with the position of the camps. The details of those routes were told later to John Knoll, the expedition photographer, and he published them in the 1927 book, Story of Everest. Mallory told me himself when he talked to me of his possible routes up the final pyramid and told me where to watch for him, that he expected to go up the northeast of the final pyramid, but if he found the gully particularly difficult, or if the west wind were particularly bad, he would take the eastern ridge, missing the gully by passing across the head of it and gaining better protection from the west wind. These routes are discussed in detail in the last step but one, and they correspond to the small gully route out the couloir and the zigzag route across the head of the couloir. I will also comment on the selection of Irvine at this point in the expedition, but we'll return to the selection of Irvine over Odell on June 5th in a later video. On April 21, no one knew how well Odell would do, and the choice is best summed up by Wade Davis in Into the Silence. As his second choice, he chose Sandry Irvine, again for quite logical reasons. Beatum was down, Hazard was of questionable strength, and Geoffrey Bruce, scarcely more experienced than Irvine, lacked Sandy's knowledge of the oxygen apparatus. Noel Odell, the only other serious possibility, though a far more experienced climber, had not performed well on the march across Tibet. His lassitude in the mornings had driven his companions to distraction, particularly Shabare, who as transport officer was responsible for breaking camp. All that concerned Mallory was success. Committed to oxygen, responsible for the safety of both climbing parties on their descent from the summit, he was not about to leave behind Irvine, the physically strongest member of the expedition, and only one who knew enough about the oxygen apparatus to improvise in a crisis. As the expedition progresses, the plan falls apart, and eventually any attempt with oxygen is abandoned. Mallory and Bruce head up from North Col on June 1 and turn around the next day. They meet Norton and Somerville on their way down, and at this point there is no plan for an additional climb. Norton and Somerville believe they will be the last party to attempt the summit. Norton and Somerville are defeated on June 4th and return to North Col, where they are met by Odell, Mallory, and Irvine. After spending just 1 hour drinking hot fluids and eating, Somerville goes to sleep. As I discussed in the It Is Known video, this is the only time Somerville saw Mallory after Somerville returned from the climb, and in that video I expressed extreme skepticism that Somerville would have handed off his camera to Mallory because of the need to change the film. As an update to that video, it can now be completely ruled out that Somerville lent the camera to Mallory because Mallory had not informed Norton of his plan to head up the mountain for a final summit attempt until after they were alone in their tent. Thus, Somerville went to sleep that night thinking the assault on the mountain was over. Mallory had not broken the news that he had secretly put together an elaborate attempt with oxygen requiring massive Sherpa support. Mallory was moving supplies around the next day, and he did not see Somerville before he headed back down the mountain. Thus, there was never a time when Mallory would have asked Somerville for the camera. Norton describes being informed of the plan for the attempt with oxygen when lying in a tent with Mallory. He and Mallory shared a tent. It is at this time that Mallory drops the news on Norton. Norton has little choice to approve it, and he is quite surprised at how they managed to get all the oxygen up to North Col when everybody had agreed back at base camp there would be no attempt with oxygen. I will get into exactly how Mallory pulled off his plan in the upcoming book, as the various details are not well suited to being presented in a video. But the one thing that is fairly clear is that Mallory wanted to go to the summit, and he didn't care what Norton thought, not about the oxygen, not about the choice of Odell. And Mallory's growing drive for the summit can be seen in one of his letters to Ruth. In the 1922 expedition, Mallory led a late attempt up to the North Col when there was too much snow on the col. This caused an avalanche in which 7 Sherpa were killed. However, in 1924, a nearly identical situation presented itself, with some Sherpa being stuck up at the top of North Col and Mallory and the others escorting them down. This time, it was Mallory who fell into a crevasse. Writing to his wife, Meanwhile, I, below, finding the best way down, had walked into an obvious crevasse. By some miscalculation, I had thought I had prodded the snow with which it was choked and where I hoped we could walk instead of cutting steps at the side of it. All the result of mere exhaustion, no doubt. But the snow gave way, and in I went with the snow tumbling all around me, down, luckily only about 10 feet, before I fetched up, half blind and breathless, to find myself most precariously supported only by my ice axe, somehow caught across the crevasse and still held in my right hand. And below was a very unpleasant black hole. Eventually, Mallory manages to get himself out of the crevasse, but it is pure luck that he was not at the bottom of the glacier. However, the point in discussing the fall into the crevasse is not just to show that Mallory had an extreme tolerance for risk, but also to illustrate an issue with the watch, namely that it didn't fall off or come apart, and this will become relevant in the watch video. Now, the June 6th and 7th climbs up from North Col to Camp 6 were uneventful, but Mallory had no way of knowing they would be. That late in the season, there was a significant risk of the monsoon setting in. It didn't, that is simply because of good luck. Had a snowstorm started while they were climbing either on June 6th or 7th, the exact same situation as 1922 would have occurred. Mallory would have to escort the Sherpas back down the mountain in the exact same avalanche-prone conditions and would put the lives of them and Irvine and Odell all in significant risk. Thus, the notion that Mallory might be willing to risk his own life but not that of Irvine is directly contradicted by him risking not only Irvine's, but Odell's and the lives of the Sherpa. The fact that there was no snowstorm does not mean there wasn't a significant risk of one occurring. That the 7 Sherpa were killed on June 7, 1922, was apparently lost to Mallory in his quest to make the summit. As a note, the brief period of high winds and light snow on June 8th was not any type of storm, as the photos on the mountain taken that day show. So while Mallory's plan could not be called suicidal, an analysis shows that all the risk was pushed onto the descent. That is, Mallory had a large Sherpa contingent get his supplies in place, but it leaves no one to assist with the descent, a noticeable difference from the original plan where both the oxygen party and 2 support climbers were to assist the entire way down. That is, if the non-oxygen party got into trouble, the oxygen party would assist because they were coming from behind. If the oxygen party got into trouble, the support climbers could come up to assist, and they would be coming from the much higher Camp 7, where they could render meaningful aid at any point east of the couloir. All of these safety precautions were abandoned, and Mallory pushed the largest risk onto the descent, that if the monsoon set in at any time during the climb, or even the descent down to North Col, it would be difficult to believe they would all get down safely from North Col. Thus, the bulk of the risk with Mallory's action was always that they would die in an avalanche getting down from North Col. That the weather held out for a couple of extra days was just a matter of luck. Another problem with Mallory's plan was that it was to leave early using moonlight. To see the problem with this, we need to know what time zone Mallory was using so we can determine sunrise, sunset, moonrise, and moonset. To do this, I used the following passage from the 1921 expedition. July 16th, I made an early start with 2 porters at 2:45 a.m. and followed the medial moraine to the island. Reached the near summit at sunrise about 5:30. Looking up sunrise on July 16th, 1921, shows it is 5:24 a.m. using UTC +6. Thus, we have set the time zone. As a note as well, on July 16th, Mallory wrote, "Back to breakfast towards 9 a.m. A pleasant morning collecting flowers, not a great variety, but some delicious honey scents and occasional cheerful blue poppy. This is not to send flowers back to Ruth. This is as part of the botanical mission of the expedition to collect plant samples. In addition to plants, the expedition collected mammals, birds, and of course rocks, though the rock samples are discussed elsewhere." And using the information about the sun and the moon, we can see the problem with Mallory's plan for leaving early by moonlight. Namely, there was none. The moon would not rise until 10 a.m., and thus would be of no benefit to Mallory for an early start. However, the moon set on June 8th at 11:24 p.m. is useful to note, as after that time his movement would be slowed dramatically. The sunrise of 5:13 a.m. and the sunset of 7:08 p.m. will also be critical to evaluating the final climb, as it explains how they were able to get back to the ice axe location. Thus, the situation on June 8th was that Mallory and Irvine had climbed to high camps that were prepared and stocked by other climbers while carrying little but their own oxygen equipment. A strong team of Sherpas carried enough oxygen to high camp for each to carry a full load of 3 bottles and still each have 1 bottle to sleep on. They had a cooker in high camp and could melt all the water that they needed. The wind was calm, the temperature warm. It was perfect weather for the job. Odell was climbing in support, and if they needed anything for their final night, they would have just sent a note down with the Sherpas telling Odell to bring it up. Mallory was in top shape and had previously stated he did not see himself coming down defeated. Prior to leaving on the expedition, Irvine had reportedly stated, "If we can get within a couple hundred yards, however hard work, if we can get that near and we can see the highest point clearly, we shall go for it. And if it is one-way traffic, so be it." And with that, they will head out on June 8th, which will be covered in the upcoming watch video. But from all that I have discussed here, there are a couple things that stick out. First, how much we know about the 1924 expedition. We know where each climber was nearly every day of the expedition, what they ate, who they talked to, what poetry they read. All in all, a very complete picture can be constructed as to what happened. And this picture shows a very modern expedition. It had the unqualified climber there just because of family connections, the Sherpas doing all the work and suffering the vast majority of the deaths, massive amounts of oxygen being used, and all the gear being left up on the mountain. Some people have romanticized the climb by noting the hobnail boots and natural fiber clothing, but photos from the Chinese in 1960 show them using the exact same hobnail boots, both lower on the mountain and on the upper slopes. And in the account of detectives on Everest, even hobnail boots are not required, with one of the Chinese reportedly climbing down the mountain after losing a boot and simply replacing it with a mitten. Why the authors would believe this account and yet find it impossible for Mallory and Irvine to have made the summit remains the true mystery of Everest. Whether Mallory and Irvine made it to the summit or not is hardly a mystery, nor is it important. History will not be rewritten. History is rarely rewritten with the truth. This is ultimately a quest for a meaningless fact, simply because it is there.